talk about white supremacy culture, lots of different things might come to mind for you. But for the purposes of our presentation today and for the program that we are all participating in together, I want us to think about white supremacy culture as the overarching ideology that typically values white people, white ideas, white epistemologies, white thought, white culture, white authors, white lives as superior to those of folks of color. So this manifests in any number of ways, whether it's the fact that the majority of Band-Aids you buy would probably match my skin tone rather than someone of a darker complexion, right? Whether it's when we talk about the classics, be it musicians or authors, typically we're thinking about, Charles Dickens before we're thinking about Khalil Gibran, right? So there's different ways this happens. When folks typically say white supremacy, we often think about white supremacists, and we ain't about that here. We're not about that anywhere, right? So when I talk about white supremacists in that way, I'm talking about groups like the Klan, the Proud Boys, the Aryan Brotherhood. And I do not presume or think any of us dabble in those woods, but I want us to know that white supremacy exists along with these, and white supremacy culture is far more insidious because it's far more hidden than these sort of outright hate groups, right? When I talk about white supremacist thought or language, I'm not just talking about the heinous racial slurs. I'm not just talking about all of the egregious examples that we can all look at and go, oh, no, that's problematic. Hush that mush, right? I'm talking about a lot of the more sort of quiet, insidious ways that we see white supremacy sort of take the stage as being both the goal for all of us, right? Or what we're supposed to believe is the goal, but also as what is normal, which you've read about a little bit in our reading today. So white supremacy culture is literally everywhere. And when I talk about white supremacy, I want for those of us who are either white or white presenting to own that we benefit from it. So a lot of times when we're talking about racial justice, particularly around Black lives, folks will think, well, I never owned a slave. Like, I've never been part of any active hate crime. We also have to think that, well, we also aren't stopping any of this, right? We're not actively working towards liberation. So while we may not have directly caused enslavement, we're complicit in a system where we're seeing a lot of these tendencies, a lot of these horrific treatments of Black particularly, and Brown and Indigenous folks being recreated. So I want us to sort of reshift that whole thought process of, that was 400 years ago, to of like, that wasn't me, that wasn't my granddad. I want us to think about, okay, it's now. What can I be doing to actively be a source of liberation and freedom and justice, all right? Because white supremacy culture, again, is everywhere. It's in the maps that we use. So the fact that the map that we typically use is this one here, where the Grand Meridian, right, where the Europeans, the white Europeans set things up to be the center of the world, where we see that the continent of Africa is a lot smaller than it actually is in real life. I enjoy this graphic here. The longer that we sort of swim in our identities or in whiteness or in white supremacy, the more oblivious it comes. It's like oxygen. We don't think about it often, but we breathe it all the time. We may not see it, but it's there. And again, the fact that when we talk about classics, when we talk about exemplar examples of poets, of authors, of architects, of whatever academics, anything that you can think of, typically we think of white folks. And so an experiment that you can think of is, what is your mental model, or who comes to mind? What does this person look like when I say accountant versus when I say criminal or terrorist? What do you think when I say, perhaps maybe not in recent years, president versus when I say nurse? So we have these different mental models that we kind of absorb around us. So like the little goldfish here, we're swimming in a white supremacist culture, and we're also kind of sponges to it unless we're intentionally acknowledging it, acknowledging our role inside it, either complicit with it or against it. So white supremacy culture is, again, not just egregious hate crime groups. It is the cultural and systemic oppression that perpetuates and maintains social, political, historical, and industrial white domination, right? So the fact that only 4 out of the Fortune 500 CEOs, Fortune 500 company CEOs, are people of color, right? White supremacy culture is also what just makes whiteness the norm. I remember when I was growing up, and potentially some makeup companies are still doing this, where when they offer you an array of like foundations, the ones for fair skin folks were typically called normal skin versus pale skin, fair skin, right? So it's these ways that we're sort of kind of creepily making whiteness the norm in ways that are tacit and then in ways that are egregious, right? Whether we're talking about Jim Crow, which we'll get into a little bit later. So with white supremacy culture, it dictates that white folks, both actively and passively, to go into what Ed was saying a little bit earlier, are complicit to or entitled to advantage or domination of Black and brown folks. It's the ways that we write history, for example. So the notion that America was discovered by a white European man, instead of perhaps if we looked at history from the perspective of indigenous folks, being like, okay, we were living there, we've been living here for years, and then this white gentleman came and then everything changed up, right? So thinking about whose stories we tell, who writes the stories, who writes the standards by which we, fulfill our work obligations or our homework obligations or what have you. So it's this kind of pervasive backdrop around us. And to understand white supremacy culture, we have to do the vulnerable work of understanding the privileges that we have within it. And privilege has unfortunately become kind of a dirty word, right? It's the other P word. It's this sort of tension point for a lot of folks. And I want to be clear when we talk about privilege. Privilege can be earned and unearned, right? So I have not earned this pale face, but I have a lot of privilege because I look like a nice white lady. But I have earned the privilege of my job and my degrees and my education, what have you, right? Me saying that I don't experience the lack of privilege that is often forced upon people of color doesn't negate the privilege I have, right? In the same way that me appearing as a white person before you doesn't negate the lack of privilege I have as an immigrant, right? So we can't think about it as a single issue privilege identity, right? We don't live single issue lives. So when we talk about having one privilege, I want us to think about it as one, perhaps really powerful, all-encompassing immunity. So the same way if I went around, let's say I was a miraculous medical anomaly and I could not catch COVID, I could wander around the world today without a mask, without a care. Whereas for folks who are, immunocompromised, they're more afraid of it. So my privilege is that I don't have to worry about the different things that cause fear to other people. So that's just kind of one example there. Also, if you're not on mute, please mute, but feel free to raise your hands or engage in the chat too. So privileges across all identities exist, but we don't tend to own them because we feel like it's a leg up. And it is in a lot of ways, but it's not in ways that, downplay the successes that you have earned for, right? So I like this image here because here we see different labels that are stuck to this poor Black woman who does not deserve these labels. Having a privilege means that other people aren't going to label you for you. Having privilege means that you're not going to be looked at. I'm going to use my friend Molly in the room. Molly, as a white woman, I know that you move through space and people aren't going to respond to you the same way they respond to a Black woman. They're not going to think about, if Molly fails at this one thing, it's because she's white. It's because of her race. Whereas unfortunately for lots of us of different identity groups, we don't have that privilege. So in not having a privilege, folks get to label us as they see fit, right? And again, privilege isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's the system that I want to talk about that encourages and rewards privileges while systematically, incessantly punishing folks who do not meet these white standards. So today, we are doing anti-racist work, as we will be throughout the Allyship Institute. We will address white privilege again, the daily advantages or immunities that I've discussed. Because when we don't talk about the elephants in the room, they run rampant. So we have to talk about privilege, even when it feels uncomfortable. Again, we get to practice self-care. This is challenge by choice, but I want you to sit with these questions. I want you to think about the advantages you've had in your life if you do have white privilege. Again, I will never ask y'all to do work that I don't do myself. I know in my life as a white presenting woman of color, I have been afforded scholarship opportunities that other people of color wouldn't have been awarded. I know that I get treated better at doctors than my other peers of color, than my own sister who's darker than I am, right? So I own my privilege. and I choose how to spend it, which we'll get into as well. When we're talking about privilege and anti-racism, I want us to also acknowledge the feelings it brings up. White fragility is real. And so if you feel that you're being challenged by some of the content, that's okay. It's all right to have feelings. It's all right to feel defensive, but I don't want that to be the end of a conversation. I want that to be the starting point of a conversation. So if I say something like white folks typically have XYZ advantage, and you're sitting there like, dang, Hannah, I worked hard for XYZ. I'm feeling angry. Maybe I'm feeling guilty. That's okay. White fragility personalizes this discomfort, right? It makes it feel like it's about you. But I want you to know that at no point in this experience am I looking at anyone being like, you, Angie, you're the, no, that's not how it is. I'm not looking at Tommy being like, Tommy, you're responsible for everything. No. But if, for example, Tommy, this brings up something for you and you're like, oh, have I been causing harm all these years? Don't shut down. Do what you can to not shut down. Continue to reflect, all right? Feelings are valid, but we can't let feelings or discomfort get in the way of doing good work. Having said that, please, please, please practice self-care. I'm open throughout this whole experience to talk about anything that might be bringing up negative feelings for you. So, race, privilege, white supremacy, and white fragility exist on individual levels. Some of these feelings you have might be sitting in your own body, in your own mind and heart. It might be interpersonally. It might be through some of the conversations we have in our different discussion groups. And it happens institutionally, right? The way that we've seen 35 states are trying to ban discussions of critical race theory. Why? Because talking about racism is uncomfortable and we don't want our kids to feel bad. And we'll get into that too, right? So I want us to know that instead of withdrawing, defending, arguing, or minimizing the role that race and white privilege and white supremacy has on all of us to different degrees, but on all of us, if we push back against this too much, we don't create growth. We don't create opportunities to actively be allies. And for everyone here who is white or who doesn't identify as Black, it's on us to carry a lot of the emotional labor that has too often been put on Black folks. So for anyone Black on the call who knows the feeling when you're sitting in a meeting, when you're sitting in a classroom and somebody says, oh, it's Black History Month, what should we do? And they look right at you and you feel like you have to carry the weight of your entire community and explain what is capital B Blackness when really you're just trying to like drink your latte and be in the meeting and not worry. It's on us as non-Black community members to take some of that burden, to do the self-education and to refrain from tokenizing and emotionalizing this work as much as possible. Again, heavy stuff. That's why we're in this together. That's why we've got 3 weeks and of course beyond to chat about that. Again, white supremacy is pervasive, but exists on a continuum. I do want to uplift intersectionality through Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. We are not single issue people who live single issue lives, but for the sake of, or for the purpose rather of Black History Month, we're going to talk about how whiteness is often positioned in opposition to Blackness and how white supremacy culture creates these 3 main tension points that make it so hard to talk about white supremacy and what it does to Black and brown folks. For those of y'all who know me, I didn't grow up in America. I did not grow up with the same taboos. Like we talked about religion and politics at the dinner table, right? Which is something that apparently we don't do here. Sorry, we're talking about it together today because white supremacy culture enforces taboos. Why? Because if we don't chip away at the taboos, the status quo can remain. And one of the tools by which white supremacy culture perpetuates itself and keeps it so that we don't challenge whiteness is through the notion of scarcity. So white supremacy is hyper individualistic. It's this notion of a zero-sum world. It's this notion of if we practice affirmative action to make up for the generations, the literal centuries in which we have put down Black communities, robbed them of their agency, their bodies, their families, their ability to own property, to learn, to live, to go jogging. If we don't talk about that, we can't talk about the value of affirmative action. And even when we get to the point of affirmative action, unfortunately, white supremacy culture is that little sort of bug in your ear that's like, if they have something, I don't have something, so I need to resist it. So white supremacy culture creates this scarcity mindset that makes you feel like we're pitting ourselves against each other. If you have something, I don't have it, I don't like it, I don't like you. That's kind of the scarcity model that white supremacy culture keeps going. Within white supremacy culture, there's also the sense of a loss of self. For each of you on the call, thinking about what you wanted to be when you grew up, or what you value, or how you might determine success for yourself. This creates a lot of pressure across racial lines, right? It's this notion of there's an objective way to win. There's an objective way to succeed. And in white supremacy culture, we're often told that the American dream only looks one way. And if I don't have it, I'm a failure. And if we're creating affirmative action opportunities for people of color and Black folks in particular, we individualize it and we feel like we're giving them a helping hand we never had. And what that does is it erases the notion of equity for equality, which we'll get into as well. So I want us to think about the tension points of scarcity and self-worth. And lastly, fear, which is the overarching thing that dominates conversations on racial justice. I like to joke that when folks meet me and I'm like, oh yeah, I do diversity work and like inclusion work, I love talking about race and racism and sexism, I usually get the same response that someone might get when they say, hey, would you like me to perform a root canal on you? People are typically not very excited to see me because there's this fear. Folks don't want to feel like they're a dummy. Folks don't want to know that they've been inadvertently complicit in practicing racist tendencies, right? We don't want to be a dummy and we don't want to be the bad guy, right? And then for those of us who are in workplaces that are predominantly white, for example, whether we ourselves are white or not white, but particularly if we are not white, if I say, hey, this practice is racist or could be construed as racist, I might be afraid that, uh-oh, my boss could fire me. Or if I'm a person of color, let's say I was a Black woman, uh-oh, if I bring up an issue, they're going to write me off as an angry Black woman. Like I'm not going to get hurt in the same way. So there's this individual fear of being seen as the bad guy for bringing up toxic issues that it stops us, right? There's a fear of being called racist more so than there's a fear of being racist for many folks, not all folks, but for many, right? And because we have this defensiveness around addressing behaviors or actions that are racist, our white supremacist culture kind of favors the notion of like, you can't call people racist more than it allows us to talk about that might be a racist practice we've inherited. How do we stop it? So again, this work is so personal. It's so emotional. It's hard, but we in this together, right? So when we're talking about white supremacy culture, I want to give all credit to Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun. In 2001, they developed this term, right? And they developed nine or 10, depending on the age of the resource, 9 or 10 key characteristics of white supremacist culture. So for everyone who signed up for the Allyship Institute, we are going to spend a day on each of those. So don't worry, this is just the entry point. And if you haven't signed up for the Allyship Institute, you still can. Registration closes at midnight. But I want us to think about these characteristics. I'm not asking that you sit with each one of them today, but kind of pick up what is resonating with you, what you are currently fighting against, or maybe what's currently fighting you and you don't know how to break out of this cycle, all right? Again, all credit to Tima Okun and Kenneth Jones. And for the purposes of uplifting Black artists, I thought I'd go for one of the classics. See, we're retaking back that word of Jean-Michel Basquiat for the following slides. So what are the characteristics of white supremacist culture? Fear first and foremost. So what white supremacy culture's number one strategy is to make us all afraid of, tipping the apple cart, so to speak. We're afraid of saying, hey, systemic racism has existed in this country for 400 years plus. It's existed in Europe and in other countries for even more hundreds of years. So we fear that if we bring this up, we're going to be called a troublemaker. We're also fearful of not knowing enough about this topic. So for each of you who's opted into this, thank you for your vulnerability in coming into the space to learn about these hard topics. This kind of fear looks a lot like codependency. And as you may or may not know, codependency is this habit of accepting toxic, unfair rules and internalizing them, and it makes it feel like it's our fault, and it sort of paralyzes us into not being able to take action against it, right? I want us to know that when we are afraid, we're easily manipulated. We are searching for senses of safety and power that white supremacy kind of tricks us into a little bit, right? So, white supremacist culture says if you just work hard enough, if you just focus on you and yourself, if you just don't go on the wrong side of the tracks, if you don't upset us too much by talking about race, why do we talk about race so much, right? It makes us feel like we'll be safe if we don't address it. But that's not true, because this is sort of like The Child of Omelas by Ursula Le Guin, the notion of we are sitting in a lot of comfort and putting a lot of pain on other people. And if we don't think about the pain that racism causes so many people, I can just keep my little blinders on and I can feel like I'm doing all right. But we have to be aware that white supremacy culture perpetuates violence at so many different levels. This is why we have the myth of the super predator. This is why news stations like Fox News or even like MSNBC are so much more likely to code Black people convening as a riot than a protest. We create this culture of fear of the other. We create this culture of fear around things that are new. It happens on a lot of different levels, right? Because this fear disconnects us from other racial identities. So the fact that we feel fearful of saying the wrong thing around Black and brown folks, or the very, very real fear that Black and brown folks have around being in entirely white spaces of, this hasn't often worked out for us in the past, right? Me saying, oh, I'm Muslim, or oh, I'm Black, or what have you, and being the only or being the other is terrifying, because white folks throughout history have weaponized privilege in different ways, right? And then the fear of not talking about white supremacy culture, it disconnects us from ourselves because we feel like we're part of this really racist rat race where there's only one way to succeed, and it has to be at the expense of other people. Again, this is heavy stuff. This is deep, 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 but let it sit with you as we go through some of these characteristics. I know enough of the folks on the call, either well enough or through snooping on some of y'all's LinkedIn's, that a lot of us are perfectionists, right? And perfectionism is another subversive tool of white supremacy culture. This is a tool that means that we show little or no appreciation about others. I want us to think about our history books. For those of you who grew up in America, or for me, who I read a lot of Howard Zinn growing up in Morocco, with the exception of Zinn, I should say, a lot of times when we're talking about success, when we're talking about beauty standards, when we're talking about intellectual standards, we're prioritizing whiteness as being the goal, as being the perfect thing. When we talk about facial symmetry or beauty, often it's white examples. When we're reading history books, we usually read about 98% of each chapter is about the white folks of a certain era. And then we might have mention of a couple Black folks and maybe a woman, right? So when we talk about white supremacy culture as encouraging or enforcing perfectionism, it feeds into the sense of fear, right? It feeds into this sense of everyone else around me is expecting me to be perfect. I can't bring up issues with systemic racism or interpersonal racism. I can't tell my boss he said something racist because he's going to think I'm not on his side. He's going to see this as a flaw, right? Or when specifically, unfortunately, when we see Black and brown folks fail or stumble, what have you. I'm thinking of the most recent Black American gymnast, Simone Biles, when she said she needed to take a break. So many people saw that as a reflection of her value as a human being and not just her needing a break, right? Too often we sort of weaponize perfectionism in these ways, right? What this means in terms of the larger culture is when we talk about DEI work, even with the Allyship Institute, right? I'm asking you to take a little time out of your day to think about this, because so often we think about DEI work as extracurricular instead of the main event. And I've used this metaphor a lot because I like food. When we talk about racial justice, we cannot think about it as a side salad. So think about Thanksgiving dinner table, right? It's not the side salad, because I don't care if you think like me or not. nobody really goes for the side salad first, right? It's the thing you go for if you have room or if somebody's watching and you want to feel like you're doing it right and you want to look good. Maybe you'll have some lettuce. I do secretly love lettuce, but we cannot think about racial justice as the side piece, the side meal. We have to think about it as integral, not extracurricular. So when we think about racial justice, I want us to think about it as the salt that we season the whole meal with. I want us to think that, yes, this is Black History Month, but how can we take what we learned from this month to do better for the rest of the months of the year, right? Not falling into this trap of perfectionism of, oh, if I can't be the perfect ally, why bother? That's not what this is about. This is about us being continuously intentional on this journey, right? To not let our inner critic turn into the standardized expectations of those around us, right? To know that perfectionism doesn't really exist. And if it does, who set those standards, right? Who's created this sort of mythical one way to do things? It wasn't women of color, right? Who created the GPA? It wasn't women of color. Who created the legal system that we ascribe to? Again, it wasn't Black folks. So when we're thinking about gold standards, I want us to think about, are those really just white standards? Again, intentionally or inadvertently. And why am I pursuing them? You're allowed to have an individual response to each of these things and individual goals that falls outside of what the norm is, right? Because again, whiteness has become the norm in so many ways. White supremacy culture also leads us to do a lot of binary thinking. Now, since the prehistoric ages, since before we were fully Homo sapiens, right? We've had to categorize things as known and unknown, familiar and new, different or same. Unfortunately, especially in an era where like politics, the world, family, all of us, we're so divided that unfortunately this binary thinking is no longer, oh, this is new, or okay, cool, something I know. We turn it into, this is safe and this is dangerous. This is right and this is wrong. And this level of extreme sort of emotionalized thinking reinforces kind of this notion of perfectionism of like, it doesn't meet the standards, it's wrong, get out, don't want it. And what that does is it doesn't allow us to continue a conversation. It creates that defensiveness I talked about a little bit earlier that allows the current status quo of white folks typically being in power to remain. And I want to again stress for white folks on the call, I'm not saying that you as individuals have all the power in the world. Again, I'm just saying you benefit from a system that does prefer whiteness. And I'm saying that the white folks who are in those positions of power, they get to coast in ways that Black folks don't, right? So think about the ways that binary thinking shows up for you in your daily life. Is it kind of, to quote George W., is it you're with us or you're against us? Is it coding things that are new or uncomfortable as bad instead of just new and uncomfortable? It's the ways in which we think, okay, either I have to support the white folks that maybe support my business, or I can support the Black folks that I want to support my business, instead of thinking it can be both. It's this sort of binary thinking that means that, again, 35 states are trying to get rid of critical race theory as like, no, it's bad. Instead of that, what if we said, okay, we can talk about this and we can still talk about white folks in history too, right? It doesn't have to be so divisive. Because binary thinking simplifies complex things in ways that are reductive and detrimental. For example, I think it was Mississippi, I want to say, they're saying that they don't want to even mention, they're saying you can mention Malcolm X, you can mention Dr. King, but you can't talk about them as racial justice activists. What are we going to talk about them though? Like, why are we just saying we can't do that? Or alternatively, you can't talk about Tulsa, Oklahoma, because there was a race riot there that real white folks took down the entire Black economy. And we don't want folks thinking about that because it's bad and it's uncomfortable. No, we can talk about that. And we can talk about the feelings it brings up. And we can talk about how to not recreate toxic, racist binary systems, right? This binary thinking, again, creates this sense of urgency, right? Like, okay, we don't have time to do more because, again, we think about racial justice as a side salad instead of the seasoning throughout the meal. Binary thinking has us thinking, well, I've made it this far in life. it could always be worse. Rather the devil you know than the devil you don't. So that's why we see a lot of hesitancy and a lot of fear around conversations like defunding the police. And for a lot of you, that might be a sore spot. When I just want to share from my perspective, when I say it, I see it as putting some of those resources towards mental health for all of us, right? Like there are more nuanced things to this. Saying Black Lives Matter doesn't mean no one else matters. It's Black Lives Matter is the yes and. It's saying we have to honor Black life because all lives can't matter until Black lives do. And we'll get into all the data your heart could desire a little bit later there. And this binary thinking, again, pits us against each other. It has us playing like a hierarchy oppression Olympics of, well, my group has it worse than this group, so we should be talking about me instead. No, we get to talk about all of this. We get to talk about all folks who are impacted by white supremacy culture, but we have to uplift Black folks because not just because it's Black History Month, but because Black folks and Indigenous folks have been so egregiously damaged by white supremacy culture in its overt and covert ways. Again, I appreciate Ed bringing up, was someone trying to share something? If not, I ask you to mute. If you're trying to share something, let's put it in the chat to start, all right? Because I realize I talk too slow today. I'm trying to bring it down. Ed mentioned earlier some of this sort of discomfort. And I want us to acknowledge and embrace discomfort, as you did, sir, without turning it into denial or defensiveness. Because when we meet information that is new to us or challenges our assumptions or challenges our sense of normal, we dismiss it as that's not true. White supremacy culture or fighting white supremacy culture really is as simple as acknowledging what is true for me may not be true for you. What my Sunday dinner looks like may not look like your Sunday dinner. What my relationship with the police is might not look like your relationship with the police for any number of reasons, right? So that's why a core part of the Allyship Institute is getting in on those Facebook comments and having these discussions and having real-time conversations, right? So that we can kind of minimize the defensiveness that we have in our own bodies and we see in each other, right? Accepting comments like, hey, that organization that you support actually funded a lot of really horrific policies, for example. Me saying that isn't saying you're the worst for shopping there. It's me saying, hey, here's some information. What can we do with this information to minimize future harm, right? It's us knowing that denial and defensiveness often show up in leadership being fragile about their own feelings. So I'm pretty open about a previous position I had where discussing the shortcomings of discussing that Black Lives Matter in the event of the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Stephon Clark. There was a lot of defensiveness on leadership of, well, I didn't know that I was supposed to do the right thing. And you've made me feel bad for not knowing that I should have supported Black lives. That's not how the conversation should have gone, right? The conversation could go, oh my God, I did not know that there are essentially modern day lynchings happening. How can I learn more and how can I be of support? Instead of steeping in that, oh no, I did the wrong thing. Do you think I'm a bad person? I think I'm a bad, it's not about that. It's about trying to be more proactive instead of reactive, right? It's about doing the self-work, whether it's with yourself, loved ones, or a therapist. Everybody get a therapist. How else are you surviving 2022, right? It's trying to steep out of that emotional place, honor the emotions that it brings up, but have those emotions start a conversation, not end a conversation, right? This defensiveness also erases racism. So I'm thinking of previous friendships or partnerships, for example, coming home at the end of a long day, saying to my ex who was white, I think I was just microaggressed. I think they were being kind of racist when they told me I spoke English good for an immigrant. And perhaps my ex saying, no, it's just because, you know, you're smart and you study. They were just giving you a compliment. And me thinking, no, that was kind of a microaggression. That was a little bit racist. So when folks say to you, I think this racist thing just happened, not getting defensive, even out of an instinct to want to protect, right? Just saying, I hear you. I understand that to you, that was racist. I understand that racist thing happened, right? Knowing that impact matters a little bit more than intent sometimes, right? Sitting with that discomfort and trying not to just erase all of the negative feelings. A lot of us on this call are fixers. We want to make sure people feel good. We want to make sure that no one has to deal with problems. But unfortunately, when we try to just sort of soothe or appease or treat the symptoms of a problem, right? We're not tackling the issue that is white supremacy culture. One of the harder things, I think, for white folks and white presenting folks, such as myself, to kind of get over this hurdle of white supremacy culture that is really hard to get over is the feeling that we all have a right to comfort, right? So it's this notion of, if my feelings are hurt, I deserve to be soothed. Let's be clear. If someone hurts your feelings, you absolutely are empowered and entitled and allowed to say, hey, this hurt my feelings. But again, it's the start of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. For example, if you inadvertently, let's say, use a word that is racially charged or racially offensive, and you didn't know it, but you use the word, you don't get to prioritize your discomfort at not knowing that you caused harm over the harm that you have caused. I'll give you an example. In the UK, where my mother is from, spent a lot of time there, we call cigarettes what in America is the F slur, as in FAG. So with friends saying casually, oh, can I have a F word? I was told, oh, no, 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 you cannot use that word here. That is a slur. That is a profanity. That is a hate crime if you use that word. You better believe I felt awful, especially as a queer woman. I was like, what the heck? No, I can't say that. And I wanted to be comforted, but I had to understand, and I had to sort of do the self-work to know I caused harm to others by using that word, even accidentally. I need to comfort them. I need to understand them before I expect them to soothe me for causing harm to them, right? A lot of times this right to comfort shows up as tone policing. So we'll see this particularly for Black women in the workplace, right? Who bring up super valid points about, why is the dress code really punitive of natural Black hairstyles? Why is the dress code really problematic when it comes to traditional Black or even Moroccan clothing, right? When Black women in particular bring this up in the workplace, statistically far more likely to be deemed as unprofessional or angry than if I were to bring it up in the workplace, or if a white man were to bring it up in the workplace, right? Because when someone says, hey, this thing you've been operating on is actually harmful to me, we feel defensive. And then we feel like our feelings matter, because they do, but our comfort cannot take precedence over the safety and well-being of others. So again, the right to comfort is one of those characteristics of white supremacy culture that show up as scapegoating those who cause discomfort. For example, if let's say I had the practice of never using closed caption, for example, which we're using today, and I really appreciate the reminder that I received to do so. If, let's say, I had forgotten to do it, and the individual who asked me to create an accessible presentation, which they deserve, which I should do, right? It should just be common sense. It should just be the kind thing to do. Let's say I forgot to put closed captioning, and this individual came up to me and said, you've disappointed me. This is what I need and what I deserve. If I said, oh, well, you're just being rude about it, and like, can you believe it? She ruined my day by bringing up the fact that I need to be inclusive. That, right? You hear it when I say it like that, right? We have to do better. We have to value the impact of things. We have to acknowledge that what I consider racism, or what we as non-Black folks consider racism, isn't the capital D definition of that, right? If I say something not meaning to be racist, that doesn't mean I wasn't racist. So if I say something problematic at any point in this experience or in our lives together, and you tell me it was racist, I don't get to tell you you're wrong, right? The same way, guys, if a woman or a femme presenting person in your life says, hey, that thing you did was sexist, you as a man don't get to go, no, 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 no. Come on, woman, I'll tell you what sexist is. We don't get to do that, right? Another characteristic of white supremacy culture that shows up is that individualism, right? And this is a tricky one because individualism is by nature a very sort of American capitalist trait. We're a very individualistic country as opposed to other countries. I have previous presentations that you can find on our training site about cultural competencies that please feel free to dive into. But when we're talking about white supremacy culture, individualism shows up as a denial of our essential interdependence, right? Toxic racist individualism shows up as the fake stereotype that the majority of people on welfare are Black women. The actual majority of people on welfare are white men, but we don't think about that, right? Instead, we think, oh, there's that woman who should have done better. She failed. She didn't support her kids. She couldn't keep her man. Individualism shows up as those egregious, horrible accusations and lies, right? Individualism shows up as pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, a phrase that actually originated ironically, right? Individualism shows up as the fact that people with generational wealth, typically white folks, because white folks have been allowed to own property for hundreds of years longer than people of color. Individualism is saying that Kendall or Kylie or one of the Jenners is a self-made millionaire without acknowledging that she has millions of dollars in trust funds and in her account because she was born to rich parents, right? In the same way that individualism is saying, oh, the second grader in my primary school class, he's failing and he's a dummy, instead of thinking, wow, this poor child doesn't have a roof over their head. Maybe they're in foster care. Maybe the classroom materials I have are super underfunded. Individualism erases the systemic advantages that some of us have and the systemic oppressions that others face. It also pits us against each other in ways, again, that are problematic because life is not a zero-sum game. We can all do better. We can all have healthcare. We can all feel healthy. We can all put food on the table through a bit more cooperation and collaboration, right? Individualism also shows up as the desire for individual recognition. So oftentimes you'll see folks of color, Black folks in particular, and Indigenous folks and Arab folks like myself, we honor our ancestors, we honor those who have paved the way before us, instead of what is typically preferred or normalized rather in white communities of saying, I did it, me, look at me, ma, top of the world. I do love James Cagney. So trying to fight against this individualism, not saying that we don't get to be proud of what we achieved, but acknowledging the systemic advantages that we do or do not have, right? Because one of the darker sides, because I'm talking about all of the negative sides. Why? Because I'm talking about white supremacy culture. Individualism makes us feel lonely. I struggled in my life personally because I will share if I expect you to share, because we don't do double standards here. I struggled with the fact that all of my friends own a home before I do. But a lot of my friends come from families who have already owned homes, who have capital, who have good credit scores. I didn't have a credit score until I was 30. So there was no way I was about to own a home, right? So it made me feel lonely because I individualized it as my own failure instead of seeing the ways that being an immigrant, being the first person in my family on American soil, not having a financial history, all of these systemic issues set me up to not be able to achieve with as much ease the things that my friends with more privilege could achieve, right? And there's lots more info on these slides, which is, again, why I will be sharing out the PDFs of all of these slides, but also they will be recorded. As promised, my dog is barking in the background. We have a few more, just a couple more traits or characteristics of white supremacy culture that I want us to think about. This one is honestly a little bit hard for me as well, is the notion of quantity over quality. I just talked a little bit about my bank account. She's skinny. There could be more money in there, right? We're taught to sort of believe that having like more square footage in our house, having more friends, having more followers, having more money, more business, that's the way to do it. Instead of thinking about the quality of things that we have, instead of thinking about the impact of things. For folks who know me, you know, I have a hard time with Amazon because a lot of their funding supports really problematic organizations and politicians and are super anti-Palestine, but that's a conversation for another time. So thinking about quantity over quality in terms of Amazon, or pick a business of your choice, right? A large business of your choice. Yeah, their revenue is looking perfection. However, what is the quality of life for the people who work there, right? What is it like in those warehouses? What is the funding going towards? How are these organizations giving back to their community in ways that are uplifting and supportive, right? It's this belief that if we can't measure it, it doesn't matter. So, for example, I know that as soon as this call is over, I'll think, okay, this many people came. Yeah, that's great. And I might forget to, I won't because I'm thinking about it now, but I might forget to think, okay, was this a valuable experience for everyone, right? Like, did I alienate people? Do they feel good? Do they like me? Are they connecting with the materials, right? So we tend to think about quantity over quality because we have this discomfort with emotions, as I mentioned earlier, right? Because we are conflict averse, right? So thinking about perhaps the last staff meeting you had, did you check off everything on the agenda? Yes. Quantity, nailed it, crushed it. We did the thing. But what was the quality of the meeting? Were folks talking over other people? Were there ideas that were disregarded because we were told this is how the meeting should go and we're going to do it, right? Like the show must go on. Thinking about quantity over quality when it comes to education systems today, like this, our local schools, nationally, internationally schools, right? We may still be having the same number of students come to our classrooms, and we don't, right? We're losing teachers of color in particular, so we're not even making the quantity mark here. But what's the quality of the education they're receiving? What's the quality of their connection with their professors and their teachers? What's the quality of our teachers' mental health, right? Like maybe you're an educator yourself and you are ticking off all the boxes. You have all your students are showing up for your labs, you're giving them their feedback. But at the end of the day, you're feeling so exhausted that yes, you've objectively checked the boxes, but what is that doing to you in that space, right? Another tool of white supremacy culture is worship of the written word. Y'all know by now, I'm a nerd. I'm a data nerd. I love writing. I love reading. But there's ways in which that's wonderful and ways in which it's secretly toxic. I've shared with you, I'm from North Africa, from the Middle East. And I remember sitting in a meeting a couple of years ago, and we talked about foreign policy for some reason, because I'm a talker. And someone described the North Africa and the Middle East as a young nation, like a young part of the world. Y'all remember how life started in Africa? I remember growing up in Morocco and doing my weekly shopping in a building that was literally thousands of years old in our Medina. But in popular Western, or in this case, American ideology, we see countries like Morocco or like Afghanistan or even India as only being a couple hundred years old. Why? Because that's when white folks got there to start writing stuff down, right? That's not how it works. We have to listen to people's stories in their own ways. So whether it's, for example, in Morocco and in a lot of indigenous American tribes and communities, oral traditions are paramount, right? We have to stop expecting things to look the way that we were taught from our white Eurocentric standards, like from our typically predominantly white education system, right? There's so many other forms of knowledge and other expressions of knowledge and art that may not be typical to white European standards. That doesn't make them less valuable, though. We see the worship of the written word also show up in a lot of tone policing in problematic ways. The ways that professional standards for emails are actually very much derived from the French. So, greetings, dear sir or madam, or what have you, or I trust this email finds you well. All of these sort of social niceties that we expect and kind of demand in emails are very, very white coded. So we punish folks with spelling mistakes. We punish folks or we judge folks who don't write stuff down. If you remember the pre-pandemic days when you went to a restaurant and the server came over to you and they just remembered the order in your head. I know a lot of y'all, me too, were like, "Ooh, she is never gonna remember, or they are never gonna remember that I asked for a substitution on that burger. It's gonna be wrong," because we don't trust people who don't write things down. We also refuse to acknowledge other forms of information that, again, haven't been tried and tested by academic services or standards or what have you, right? Worship of the written word means that we recreate history because, again, what is it? There's an African proverb that until the lion learns to write, the hunter will tell the stories, right? So this idea that we need the documentation, we need it to look a certain way. Otherwise, we don't listen to other people. The way we punish Black slang, for example, in professional settings, but appropriate it in more casual settings, right? The ways that we sort of require originality to meet a certain standard. It's very like professional, right? And I know for a lot of you, this might be like, well, how else could we do it? It feels like chaos if we don't write things down in a memo. Remember the binary thinking and the fear and the discomfort as other characteristics of white supremacy culture? They all kind of interrelate. So I want us to think about the fear factor of thinking about how we might do things differently that aren't rooted in white tradition. New stuff is scary and change is hard, and that's okay. But again, I want us to use that discomfort to start the conversation, not to end the conversation. And I think this is my last characteristic for white supremacy culture is urgency. This anxious, anxiety all day feeling like we got to do this now. This feeling that, okay, if I have to meet this goal for my business and time is short and COVID's ruined everything, and oh no, my mom's feeling sick and like I got to pick up the kids, I don't have time to think about racial justice, right? No, that's white supremacy culture saying that you don't get to reshift priorities to be more inclusive and equitable, right? What this means is a lot of times, like my example before, at an institution I used to work at, there was such hesitation to literally say Black Lives Matter for fear of alienating white conservative donors. There was this level of urgency of, well, I can't support people's humanity because it affects my bottom line. That's kind of messed up, right? It creates this urgency and this fear and this division that literally doesn't need to be there. Because again, you're allowed to feel uncomfortable in these conversations. I feel uncomfortable all the damn time, but we can't have it be divisive. We can't have it pit us against each other. This urgency reinforces existing power hierarchies too. So the idea of if we do things differently, or if we say, I would like to do something differently, I would like to change up staff meetings and how we measure success for our marketing program. A lot of times from leadership, you'll get this sense of, and maybe not just leadership, right? Well, we can't do it. We've always done it this way. That's too scary. That reinforces the power hierarchies, right? Because remember I said the devil you know is better than the devil you don't sort of thing. We get complacent, we get comfortable, and we get afraid of change. And as someone who works in nonprofits, and I know a lot of y'all work in nonprofit too, this sense of urgency or in education promises so much work for not enough money. It tells us we just got to get through this week. We just got to get through this pandemic, which is apparently lasting 400 years. It doesn't allow us to catch our breath and do better to support other people. It encourages shame for when we feel like we can't meet these goals. It reproduces this binary thinking, as I mentioned, right? Like, are you with us or against us? Like everything, we're firing in all cylinders. And what this sense of urgency does is it creates both an individual, interpersonal, and institutional sense of panic that doesn't let us focus on how we can get out of the panic. It leads to burnout too, right? Because if you're constantly in a state of fear, how are you supposed to sort of catch your breath and reevaluate and allow for creative thinking, to allow for solutions thinking instead of just survival? So white supremacy culture is about, it's about the narrative of fear and survival instead of support, instead of growth. And so for white folks in the call, you might struggle with some of this internalized white superiority. Not saying you think you're better than everyone here, unless you do, in which case, let's talk. What's your secret? But it's sort of this idea of how I approach the world is how everyone approaches the world. Because we get complacent. We take for granted our bodies, right? We swim in our own identities. We know our identities, and we sometimes presume that others will relate to us. Again, the example of the police. Maybe you have a phenomenal relationship with local law enforcement. That's awesome. But you can't expect that everyone else does, right? So we can't expect that our standards and norms are universal. We can't expect to be 100% comfortable 100% of the time. The world cannot revolve around any one of us individually. We have earned a lot of our privileges, but we also have to acknowledge that sometimes we've had helping hands or benefits that others haven't had. And again, this last one here of I'm not responsible for what happened before, a lot of times I'll hear this: I didn't own slaves, I didn't vote against the Black folks being able to vote. Okay, you didn't, but we're living in a legacy where that has happened. So instead of thinking, well, I didn't do that, think, what can I be doing to make things better now in whatever sphere of influence you have? And for folks on the call who are folks of color like myself, we internalize white supremacy culture in the form of racial oppression, in terms of the fact growing up, I never thought I was pretty because I didn't look white enough, right? I don't have a white girl body. I'm ugly. Like, that's the messaging I still struggle with. Carrying these internalized negative messages, feeling like you're either perpetually on the defense of people coming for you, feeling like you always have to tokenize yourself to defend your people, feeling like you have to represent all Black folks at all times. That's not a job anyone signed up for. I often share this. I've chosen this line of work because it was a line of work that was put upon me anyway, right? Colorism, the idea that we all want to look a certain way. So there's different ways that white supremacy characteristics show up for each of us. And so I know we're reaching 1 o'clock. For those who are able to stay on a little bit later, I'm more than happy to hang out too. But for those of you who might want to go, I ask you to consider and join in on the Facebook group or through email. How have you seen white supremacy culture characteristics show up in yourself? Through binary thinking, through fear, through urgency, through worship of the written word, any of those examples. And if it's a little bit too personal and you're not quite ready to dig deep into yourself just yet, how have you seen these characteristics of white supremacy culture show up in either the people or the institutions around you? Because sometimes it's easier to look at others instead of ourselves. And I'll give y'all a break this first couple of days. We can look at others before we look at ourselves, but we will be doing some self-work too. So I'll share these out in more concrete forms, but ways that we can combat white supremacy culture is to develop a culture of appreciation instead of a culture of oppression. Create environments where we're allowed to own our mistakes, where we're allowed to talk from discomfort, to realize that our inner voice, our inner critic, is not productive sometimes, and that the criticisms of others aren't productive. To write realistic proposals and rethink the way we approach time and money to be more supportive of other folks. To work on our own defensiveness, right? To work on our ability to communicate constructive criticism, to not require folks to tone police their hurt, right? Not requiring Black and brown folks to make their trauma palatable for you. For example, if someone comes to you and says that they have been harmed and that makes you upset, your comfort can't take precedence over their pain, right? And then if there is a moment of conflict and you are able to sort of work through your own discomfort and come to a resolution, to always check in about that afterwards, because this conversation isn't one and done, right? This is lifelong work. Allyship is a verb. And for the folks who are part of the Allyship Institute, again, if you haven't signed up, sign up by midnight. We will be spending a lot of the last 2 weeks on antidotes. I want us to first start off with understanding kind of the landscape. But for each of these characteristics, we're going to think of antidotes or ways to heal from them, both as folks of color, as white folks, and as white folks who need to support folks of color. What does this all make you think? How are you feeling in your head? How are you feeling in your heart? And then with your hands, with your words, with your actions, what can you and what are you going to do to be more supportive to folks? So I will stop sharing the screen there. I think I've stopped sharing my screen. I will stop streaming live on Facebook so that we can have a little opportunity to connect